Imagine being a 10-year-old girl ripped from your family and told your life no longer belongs to you. You're chosen, not for talent, not for ambition, but for purity, bound to serve a goddess and the state for 30 years. Rome watches you, reveres you, until a single mistake could end your life. And when that day comes, they don't send soldiers, they don't draw swords, they bury you alive, in total silence, under the weight of empire itself. What would it feel like to live every day as sacred property, adored by millions, yet walking on a razor's edge of law and ritual? To guard a flame that symbolizes the life of Rome, while knowing that one misstep could erase your existence forever. This isn't a story about kings or generals. This is the terrifying reality of Rome's Vestal Virgins, the girls who were God's chosen, yet prisoners of the state, whose purity was political, whose devotion was deadly, and whose lives were a currency of power.
From the very moment she was chosen, her life ceased to be her own. Picture a girl no older than 10, standing among her peers as the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, pointed directly at her. That gesture, simple yet absolute, changed everything. Her family, likely torn between pride and dread, had to watch her step away, crossing the Sacra Via for the last time as a child of Rome. From then on, she belonged entirely to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and to the Roman state. Her body, her freedom, even her name would become state property. Sacred, yet constrained. The selection process itself was terrifying in its precision. Only girls between 6 and 10, born of a legally recognized marriage, unblemished in body, and with both parents alive, could even be considered. This wasn't a lottery anyone wanted to win. Many families cried, not from honor, but from the fear of what awaited their daughter. To be chosen as a Vestal Virgin meant 30 years of devotion, discipline, and isolation. She would be trained, serve, and eventually instruct other Vestals. But her life outside the Atrium Vestae, her home, her family, even her own identity, was effectively over. Her role wasn't just religious, it was political. Guarding the sacred flame meant safeguarding Rome itself, and her chastity was seen as a direct reflection of the city's moral and spiritual health. The weight of this responsibility was crushing, and every action, every word, even the slightest hint of misconduct could be scrutinized and punished. These girls lived in a gilded cage, revered in public, yet constantly under watchful eyes, bound by laws stricter than iron. But here's where it gets wild. This sacred life, devoted to purity and the gods, wasn't safe. Reverence could flip to lethal scrutiny in an instant. One misstep, one rumor, one extinguished flame, and Rome's justice, unforgiving, silent, and terrifying, would come calling. And the penalties were as calculated as they were brutal.
As she settled into the Atrium Vestae, the reality of her new existence hit hard. The complex was a secluded world within the heart of Rome, adjacent to the Temple of Vesta in the Forum. Walls that seemed protective were also a constant reminder she was no longer free. Her days were filled with ritual, learning, and endless supervision. Senior Vestals and priests monitored every move, every interaction, ensuring obedience to laws that were as rigid as they were merciless. For the first 10 years, she was a student of sacred duty, learning the ceremonies, memorizing prayers, and absorbing the rules that would govern the rest of her life. Even in this early stage, the pressure was immense. Her chastity wasn't just personal virtue, it was political insurance. Any hint of misbehavior could be interpreted as a threat to the stability of Rome itself. Imagine the fear. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every fleeting thought was potentially a crime. The state's gaze was constant, invisible yet suffocating, shaping her into an icon long before she understood what that truly meant. By the time she moved from learning to performing her sacred duties, the Vestal Virgin's life had become a delicate balancing act. She maintained the eternal flame, the very symbol of Rome's survival, while embodying purity and obedience. Her actions were more than ritual, they were statements of state power. And as she walked the corridors of the Atrium Vestae, barefoot and veiled in white, she carried not just religious significance, but the weight of an empire on her shoulders. But here's the part that's chilling. Even the most revered Vestals weren't immune to punishment. The laws that protected Rome's virtue also ensured her constant vulnerability. One mistake, even an accident, and the consequences were swift, hidden, and terrifying, demonstrating that in Rome, devotion came at a deadly price.
The Vestals' rules were absolute, and the consequences for breaking them were merciless. Their three core duties, perpetual virginity, unwavering obedience, and the eternal guardianship of the sacred flame, were the pillars of Rome's moral and spiritual order. Violate even one, and the result was not just personal shame, it was considered an affront to the state itself. If the sacred fire ever went out, the city didn't just see it as a ritual failure. It was an omen, a warning that Rome itself could be in danger. The reigning chief Vestal could face punishment immediately, often at night, away from public view, beaten with rods in total darkness, leaving her dignity intact in public while her body suffered in silence. Psychological control was just as relentless. For 30 years, a Vestal was celibate, confined within the Atrium Vestae, her life circumscribed by walls and ritual. She could not speak freely with men, and even innocent interactions were dangerous. A single rumor could trigger a full investigation by the College of Pontiffs. In Rome, the presumption of innocence was almost non-existent. Once accused, she had little chance of defending herself. She lived as sacred property, adored publicly, but scrutinized privately, a constant tension between reverence and terror. Even the most minor lapses could be deadly. The Vestals existed in a paradox, honored as divine symbols, yet walking on a razor's edge, where one misstep could end her life. Their body was a political instrument, their chastity a literal safeguard of the state's stability. Imagine carrying that responsibility as a child, knowing that every thought, every glance could be fatal. And beyond the personal fear, there was the crushing isolation, the slow erosion of identity, as she became a symbol first and a human second. But here's where it escalates. The penalties for violating these sacred vows weren't just fines or public shaming. Rome had a punishment so cold that it erased the Vestal from existence entirely, leaving nothing but silence behind.
The most feared punishment for a Vestal wasn't public humiliation or even physical torment. It was burial alive. The offense was called incestum, the sacred violation of Vesta's purity. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, Rome didn't shed blood. It didn't need to. Instead, the state claimed divine neutrality, leaving her to the gods in a ritual that was horrifying in its calm precision. It was a punishment reserved for the most revered women in the city, women whose lives had once symbolized the strength and virtue of Rome itself. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 216 BCE, when two Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were accused of incestum. The trial was private. Any defense they might have offered has been lost to history. Once judged guilty, their fates were sealed. One was forced into the earth alive, while the other, seeing no escape, took her own life. The process was eerily ceremonial. The condemned was shrouded in white, barefoot, veiled, and led through the forum in a solemn procession. To the untrained eye, it resembled a bride walking to her wedding. But this was a funeral, a slow, silent march to death. The burial site, Campus Scholaratus, meaning field of the wicked, was carefully prepared. Inside a subterranean chamber awaited a small bed, a lamp, bread, water, and milk, enough sustenance to suggest life, but never enough to save her. Once she descended, the entrance was sealed with earth and stones. The Romans insisted this wasn't execution. It was divine custody. No one heard her final moments. No legal appeal was possible, and the silence of the tomb amplified the cruelty. The state had transformed the punishment into ritual, sanctifying the act while extinguishing a human life. Yet, even in this horror, there was a method to Rome's control. By avoiding public spectacle, they maintained the Vestal's image of sacred virtue in the eyes of the populace. Reverence could coexist with terror, and the city preserved its moral authority while executing ruthless justice beneath the soil. But here's where it gets chilling. This wasn't just punishment. It was a statement. Rome was demonstrating that devotion, purity, and obedience were non-negotiable, even if it meant burying one of its own daughters alive.
The silence surrounding a Vestal's execution was as deliberate as the tomb itself. No blood was shed, no cries echoed through the forum, only the stillness of a life erased. By providing minimal sustenance, bread, water, milk, the Romans could claim they were merely leaving her in the care of the gods, absolving themselves of murder while ensuring the outcome was inevitable. It was a cruel illusion of mercy, a way for the state to maintain its image while delivering the harshest possible punishment. Once sealed underground, there was no escape, no rescue, no appeal, no second chance. The woman who had once embodied Rome's sacred ideals vanished, leaving behind only the weight of the empire's moral authority. For the citizens above, life went on. The public never witnessed the death, yet the lesson was unmistakable. Reverence for the Vestals was conditional, tightly bound to obedience. These women were adored as living symbols of Rome's eternal flame. But the moment they faltered, the state's mercy evaporated. It was a stark reminder that in Rome, virtue and fear were intertwined, that purity was prized only as long as it served the city's stability, and that power, religious or political, could be as deadly as any sword. The fate of these young women also highlights a deeper, chilling truth about Roman society: the willingness to sacrifice humanity in pursuit of an ideal. Innocence was sanctified, yet imperfection was punished with calculated brutality. Life, identity, and even the memory of the Vestals could be buried beneath the soil, demonstrating that in the Roman worldview, the state's moral and spiritual order outweighed the individual entirely. And so the story of Rome's Vestal Virgins is one of paradox: sacred yet imprisoned, revered yet silenced, honored yet expendable. They were symbols of purity, guardians of a flame, and cautionary examples of what happens when devotion collides with the rigid demands of empire. But here's the question that lingers. In a society willing to sanctify innocence and bury imperfection, what does humanity itself lose?
Living as a Vestal Virgin was not just about avoiding mistakes. It was about embodying Rome's ideals every single day. 30 years of service meant a lifetime measured by ritual, obedience, and isolation. For 10 years, she learned the sacred rites, absorbing every chant, every ceremonial motion, every detail of her duties. The next 10 were spent performing those duties, guarding the eternal flame that symbolized Rome itself. The final decade was dedicated to instructing the next generation of Vestals, ensuring the cycle continued. Her life became a living curriculum of devotion, discipline, and above all, control. Her body, her choices, even her thoughts were political instruments. Touch, desire, or disobedience could threaten not just her life, but the stability of Rome. The city treated her chastity as a moral compass. If she faltered, it was more than a personal failure. It was an omen, a reflection of Rome's potential decay. Imagine growing up knowing that a single misstep, perhaps even an accident, could lead to ritualized death, isolation, or public disgrace. Fear was constant, yet invisible, like an invisible chain around her heart. Even as she became an icon, there was a psychological cost. Social bonds outside the Atrium Vestae were forbidden, her interactions heavily monitored. Conversations, gestures, or even rumors could spark investigations. The pressure to remain flawless in public while living in extreme isolation
created a tension that few could endure. Revered yet imprisoned, adored yet scrutinized, the Vestal's existence was a paradox of honor and terror. And here's the mind-blowing part. This rigid control wasn't limited to the worst offenders. Even the most faithful Vestals lived in the shadow of potential punishment. Rome institutionalized fear, teaching its citizens through ritualized discipline that the divine and the political were inseparable, and that purity, while celebrated, came at the ultimate cost.
Despite their revered status, Vestal Virgins were never truly free from danger. Their sanctity was a double-edged sword, adored in public, yet constantly monitored and vulnerable to suspicion. The laws that protected Rome's moral and spiritual order also created a world where one rumor could decide a Vestal's fate. The slightest hint of impropriety could trigger a full investigation by the College of Pontiffs, and once accused, innocence was rarely presumed. She could not appeal, could not defend herself fully, and the full weight of the state could fall on her shoulders without mercy. Even the punishment methods reflected Rome's cold efficiency. If the sacred flame went out, the reigning chief Vestal might be scourged, beaten with rods in total darkness, ensuring public decorum while enforcing the law with brutal discretion. The city maintained the illusion of sanctity above all, yet beneath it lay a terrifying truth. Devotion without error was expected, and failure, whether intentional or accidental, could be fatal. Psychological pressure was relentless. Isolation, constant observation, and the knowledge that her body symbolized Rome's survival created a tension that was nearly impossible to endure. Yet for 30 years, these women carried this burden without reprieve. They were teachers, guardians, and symbols of eternal Rome. Their lives were meticulously structured around the flame and the rituals of the Atrium Vestae, each moment a test of obedience and purity. Imagine walking through your entire life knowing that any mistake, even one unseen by others, could mean death. Their existence was a paradox of reverence and terror, a daily reminder that in Rome, power, religion, and fear were inseparable. And here's the part that haunts history. The Vestal's ultimate fate shows just how far Rome would go to preserve its ideals. Revered yet expendable, sacred yet imprisoned, these women reveal the terrifying cost of a society that prioritized purity over humanity.
The most haunting part of the Vestal story is the ritual of burial alive. Punishment so calculated, it erased a person without spilling a drop of blood. When accused of incestum, the sacred violation of Vesta's purity, the Vestal Virgin was led through the forum in a silent procession. Cloaked in white, barefoot, and veiled like a bride, she walked not toward a wedding, but toward her grave. The Romans prepared a subterranean chamber in the Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked, complete with a lamp, bread, water, and milk. It was designed to simulate life, to claim the gods were taking custody of her, yet in reality, it was a death sentence, sealed beneath earth and stone. This ritual was meticulously private. No crowd, no public spectacle, no cries of anguish. The city maintained her image as sacred and untouchable, even as it ended her life. Her name, reputation, and existence were buried along with her, a chilling testament to Rome's ability to combine devotion with merciless authority. Silence itself became a weapon, erasing her from memory and teaching the living that perfection wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. And yet, through this cruelty, the Vestal story speaks volumes about Rome's values. Innocence was elevated, worshipped, and revered, but any imperfection was extinguished with calculated precision. These women lived as both symbols and warnings, demonstrating the deadly intersection of religion, law, and state power. The flame they guarded represented more than fire. It was Rome's life, morality, and the terrifying power to enforce obedience at any cost. But here's the lingering question. When a society sanctifies innocence and punishes imperfection with such cold efficiency, what does it lose in the process? Humanity itself becomes a casualty of virtue, buried beneath the weight of empire.
The story of Rome's Vestal Virgins forces us to confront the paradox of power and piety. These girls were chosen as symbols of purity and guardians of the eternal flame, yet their very sanctity made them vulnerable to some of the most extreme punishments imaginable. For 30 years, they lived a life of strict rules, isolation, and constant surveillance. They could not marry, could not form typical social bonds, and could not make a single mistake without risking death. Revered publicly,
They were trapped privately, their lives a delicate balance between devotion and terror. Their experience reveals just how entwined religion and politics were in Rome. A Vestal's chastity wasn't merely a personal virtue, it was a state concern. The flame they protected symbolized the survival of the city, and the moral integrity of one girl was equated with the fate of an entire empire. Imagine that kind of pressure on a child, then a young woman, then a teacher of the next generation. Every decision, every glance, even the smallest rumor could trigger investigation, punishment, or death. Their existence was a constant test, an unyielding standard imposed by the state, cloaked in ritual and reverence. Yet the most harrowing aspect is the calculated precision of Rome's justice. Burial alive for violating chastity wasn't random cruelty. It was a carefully orchestrated act designed to uphold the illusion of divine order. The Vestal's disappearance was absolute, silent, and sanctioned by law, leaving a haunting imprint on Roman society. Revered as sacred, yet expendable, these women embodied the tension between public honor and private vulnerability, revealing a civilization willing to demand perfection at any cost. And here's the stark takeaway. In a society that sanctifies purity while punishing imperfection with ruthless precision, the human cost is invisible, yet profound. The Vestals remind us that devotion, when weaponized, can become a tool of oppression, and that the pursuit of ideal virtue can sometimes bury humanity itself.
The legacy of Rome's Vestal Virgins extends far beyond the rituals, the flame, or the silent tombs. These women were both revered icons and living instruments of state power, their bodies and lives transformed into symbols of Rome's moral and political order. For centuries, their existence communicated a message. Purity was paramount, obedience was absolute, and deviation would not be tolerated. To the citizens of Rome, they were paragons of virtue, walking embodiments of the city's ideals. Yet, behind closed doors, their reality was one of fear, isolation, and the constant threat of annihilation. Their lives also illuminate the harsh intersection of law, religion, and gender. As children, they were chosen and removed from their families. As young women, they endured scrutiny and psychological pressure that would be unimaginable today. And as senior Vestals, they bore the responsibility of teaching others to navigate the same perilous path. 30 years of service shaped their identities. Yet, the moment they erred, even unintentionally, the state could erase them, as in the chilling case of Opimia and Floronia in 216 BCE. Burial alive wasn't just punishment, it was a statement of the empire's absolute authority over sacred and human life alike. The story of the Vestals forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the price of idealized virtue. How much control should a society exert over its citizens in the name of morality? How much humanity is sacrificed when purity becomes a political weapon? In the shadow of these rituals, it becomes clear that Rome was willing to sanctify innocence while punishing imperfection with merciless precision. The Vestals' lives, and sometimes their deaths, reveal a civilization where devotion could be deadly, where reverence coexisted with terror, and where the boundaries between faith and oppression were deliberately blurred. And so, the tale of Rome's Vestal Virgins remains haunting, a reminder that even in the pursuit of sacred ideals, humanity can become the ultimate casualty.